So just to introduce everyone, firstly, the panel is going to be about building local data ecosystems, what is available and why does it matter. Paul Court from the City of Cape Town will be chairing the session for us. Paul is the Chief Economist of the City of Cape Town. We have spent nearly 12 years conducting macro research, producing economic intelligence, and developing policies to attract investment. Dieter von Fintel is Professor of Economics and Vice Dean for Research, Postgrad Affairs and Internationalization, Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at Stellenbosch University. And Andrew Nell is an independent researcher and consultant specializing in economic research and urban development, specifically looking at the data and how data can improve cities. And then a special welcome to Aliasgher Janmohammed from the Open Cities Lab. Aliasgher has worked with various partners, including the City of Cape Town, Ethiopia, Johannesburg, and Ecoleni, to build evidence-based tools that improve the decision of local government level, connecting city practitioners to residents' problems. He is passionate about helping cities become better spaces for people, as we all are. Thank you so much, guys. Paul?
Thank you, Fouché, and thank you for the privilege of inviting me to chair this auspicious panel. And fantastic welcoming words and keynote address, Ivan. I was sitting here thinking, it's really not a difficult gig being an economist at a city level, because when you've got conferences, you land up, you can sometimes have very tight conferences with about 5 topics which you can submit papers under, and then there can be this catch-all one, which is just city economies. And you can just, in my case, working as an economist within a city environment, I can pretty much submit any aspect of my work to that. And it got me thinking, I wonder, so this focus on urban economics and on cities is so important in the South African context, and we're going to talk a little bit about that now from a data perspective. But it's so important to shine the light on metro areas and to shine the light on cities that it has to be in place. But at the same time, I wonder if our measure of success eventually is that we don't have this distinctive field, but it's to some extent economists working in different spaces. So an economist working on a city-related issue like transport is a transport economist. There's somebody working on water and waste is somebody that's an infrastructure economist, or you've got macroeconomists working in the city. It strikes me very similarly as we did some work on the informal economy a number of years ago, and one tends to look at the formal economy, and the formal economy is complex. There's services, there's trade, there's manufacturing, a whole range of things. And then you have the informal sector as if it's just one sector. There's only one thing that happens in the informal sector. That's all it is, sort of thing. Whereas you've got the exact replication of the formal sector, but in the informal sector. And in many ways, you've got the same representation of the economics discipline at a city level. It's not necessarily, there's distinctiveness, but at the same time, sometimes breaking those walls are also useful. All right, so that was off the cuff. I do have some opening remarks that I'd like to share just from a City of Cape Town perspective, and then I will bring in each of the panelists. It is going to be relatively unstructured, so those of you among us that really like structure, you might find this a bit of a mind bender, but I want the conversation to flow. So I would say to each one of you, if you want to interject, I've obviously got to ask one of you a question at a time, but if you want to interject and say that he's talking rubbish, please feel free to do so. So Ivan mentioned cities at the moment constitute just under 60% of labor. The last stat I saw was about 53%, if you count up all the metros, probably based on QLFS. A little bit more in terms of GDP, which is kind of what you would expect, right? Because you would imagine that cities would be more capital-intensive places and more skill-intensive than other areas. So these are really large focus areas for our economy. And so we're now going to be talking specifically, I'm going to switch now, less about cities, but about data within cities and the need for data for cities. Now, data is a major buzzword. Any conference you go to, you're going to be talking about data, the profession of data science, of data engineering. There's a whole range of them. Aliasgher can unpack all of that for us. And it's so in vogue at the moment, But data for data's sake doesn't get you anywhere. We need data for analysis. We need data for, I mean, in my case, economic analysis, but data to inform decision making. And that is very much true at a city level as well. So just to get a bit of a sense of this kind of data landscape within South Africa, I almost see there being three sort of types of data. There's your kind of organizational insights data, data which you gain from going about your business normally. So in City of Cape Town's case, we would obviously have data on water consumption and various things and electricity and the like. From a business perspective, you will have data on consumption and pricing and all of those kind of things. That helps you ideally make your offering a little bit more efficient. Then you've got data that can act as proxies as well. Normally it would have been gathered for the existing reason of data for operational needs, but can easily proxy something. So if I think about City of Cape Town's case, we manage vehicle registrations, but then we don't use it for anything other than vehicle registrations, where it is a known leading indicator of economic growth, for example. So one can begin to leverage that sort of thing for. And then probably what we'll zoom in on a little bit more today is your kind of more macro data or your economic outcomes data. So yeah, I'm obviously focusing on the economic side of things. And there we're talking a lot more outcomes level, and we're talking about what impact has this had on various macro or household level variables. Now, where is this data kind of stored, and where do we get this from? So obviously those kind of organizational insights data comes at point of contact with a client. So from a city's perspective with a ratepayer, from a firm's perspective with a customer. But when it comes to that macro outcomes related data, that is very much in the South African context a top-down data pool, let's say. So we are highly dependent on StasSA, and in particular on things like census. I did see our StasSA colleagues here, on census and on well, it's mainly StasSA is the central source from which the majority of our data as cities comes from. Even the data which we think doesn't come from StasSA is ultimately modeled from StasSA. Then you've got administrative data and SARS, and we're going to talk about this just now. The SARS data is an incredible data set as well. But when you get to a sort of local level, there's not a lot of data generated for these explicit purposes. Data tends to be a little bit more of a byproduct. So you'll find not a lot of cities undertake distinctive survey-related data collection. We're beginning. We've done a socioeconomic survey now recently. We had about 8,000 household respondents, but there have been some challenges. And we've done various transport surveys. But it's not something that's typically regarded as a key function of a city. So we are very tied to a very top-down kind of data infrastructure within South Africa. All right. So I just want to then talk a little bit about why. So we will pose that question later. How do we turn that around, or do we need to turn that around? But maybe just to say for now, why do cities need data in the first place? And we've often been in our journey to try and really get more data. So we were very involved in the SARS initiative, or the initiative to get SARS data, for a number of years. And we were frequently asked as municipalities and metros to prove how we would use it. That's the starting point. How would you use this? Can you be considered responsible to have this data? I mean, I've got my thoughts on that. I think data should be more democratized than that, and certainly you should trust in your cities to be able to use it. But we spent a lot of time thinking about how we would use this data, and I'm just going to go into it for a little bit, what cities can do with data. So obviously, and now we are talking a little bit more about economic data, obviously better data at a local level is good for understanding our local economies and for economic insights related to them. To the extent that cities can assist businesses, which is sometimes limited, I'll be honest, but to the extent that cities can assist businesses and promote their destinations, we have to know how our economy is doing, and we have to know the specific sectoral dynamics of that. So which sectors are growing, in what places are they growing, what is happening to the labor market generally. All of these things are essential for us understanding how our economy is doing and understanding our points of comparative advantage as well. So I think that's in many ways, that's a little bit of a no-brainer. That's the classic sort of economic angle, but it's incredibly important from a planning perspective as well, because ultimately we need to know where people are moving, where they live, where they work. Now, in South Africa, I'm going to say historically, it's been very easy to understand where people live. Obviously, there's been some challenges with the later census, but where people work has not always been so easy to come by. Now, how can you efficiently plan for transport if you don't know where people are moving to? So you start looking at other sources. You start looking at maybe mobile phone data, you look at traffic counts, but it is essential for us to get an understanding of employment at place of work. So that's where the SARS data was. I see it as one of my life's achievements, not because let's not, that's way too up there. I see it as something memorable that I've been a part in for a number of years that has actually materialized, and those of you that work in government will know that is sometimes too few and far between. So seeing the SARS data come and actually be materialized there and being able to understand largely, not various challenges with head office effect notwithstanding, where people work has been a major win for us. And that obviously helps us with planning, but it also helps with planning from the perspective of how you zone things as well. So I'll come back to that in a moment. The last one is in terms of services. The city has service relationships with people, of course, and we need to understand things like income levels, so that we get our rebates targeting correct. We need to understand things like consumption patterns. So there's a whole range of things and a whole range of reasons why cities obviously need better data. To just give a few examples, I'm going to wrap this up in a few minutes because I'm sure you want to hear from the panel. To give a few examples from a city perspective, we were recently asked a question around a particular area in Cape Town. It's the area called Pardon Island, and I haven't always lived in Cape Town, so when I first heard that talked about in meetings, I assumed it was Robben Island's smaller sort of sister, was industrialized. But this is called Pardon Island. It's an industrial area next to the coast. And what we were being asked about that is, should we allow for mixed-use development for these big potential high-rises that people want to, that developers want to build, and to try and understand whether that's something that we, from a planning perspective, could allow for. We needed to understand: are there distinctive industries in Pardon Island that, if they get priced out of it, would be a problem for the city? Now, that level of granular information just wasn't there a number of years back, and particularly we were looking at the boat building industry. It's close to the ports. The boat builders can't really go anywhere else. They need to be close. They can't be near a range of low-lying bridges because they'll get their masts knocked off. So they have to be located close to the port. So we needed to understand their footprint in that area. At the time, that was very difficult to do, but now with the SARS data and being able to actually scrutinize it a little bit more, moving down the SIC codes, there are masking related issues, but there was an area that was sufficient enough. We were really able to get a sense of that industry and how that's grown in the area. That helps us inform a very specific city function. So we often think, well, the cities we don't have the main economic levers. That's true to an extent. We don't do anything on tax, we don't do trade policy, we don't do labor markets, etc. But these place-based initiatives and our responsibilities are critically important. What we chose to do there with land use can make or break an area for a particular industry and the viability of that area. And having the right data to make informed decisions is absolutely essential. Ivan talked about what we call SSRUs, small-scale rental units. We're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how many of these are in the various township areas within Cape Town. Again, it's an area of data paucity. Unfortunately, SARS data really can't help with that one. So there we're looking wider. But we've had to do a lot of visual mapping. There's LiDAR-related stuff. We even had a helicopter fly over and you can identify the different units. But again, understanding how many, it sounds like in the age of very interesting data, that sounds very trite, just how many units there are. is crucial, because what's happening is that we actually can't control it, so they're going to happen anyway. But the overburdening on the infrastructure is huge. So we've got to expand the infrastructure. How do we expand the infrastructure? Well, we try to project the number of units going forward based on a baseline. So those are the kind of very practical things that cities need to do and need data to be able to inform that. So now, obviously, so just to wrap up, at the moment, we still have there's been some wonderful developments in the data space in recent times. The SARS one is probably a bit of a headliner, and that's enabled us to do a lot of things. But the movements in the SARS space, together with local level pushes for data, has resulted in more collaboration opportunities. So we've found that the city's approach, so Cape Town's approach, in launching a first externally focused data strategy that was it was a few months ago now. We put a data strategy out into the market. We had an internal one in the past, and we collaborated with friends here from Open Cities Lab as well. Working on our open data portal, we've appointed a chief data officer. We have a growing data science team, is sending a signal to other potential data collaborators, which I think is really crucial. So now, not only are we hopefully pressurizing for more data releases at a national level and engaging with StasSA through normal channels, but we're having people come to us like I had recently, somebody from ShopRite X, so Checkers, and want to see how they could use their retail data. They've got these extra savings, you know, the extra savings program. If I said, how many of you are on the extra savings, have the extra savings card here, you'll probably find a large percentage. They reckon they've got 30 million unique IDs on that. And that gives retail trends and retail spending trends, which companies have used to create credit profiles for people that have never had credit profiles before based on their retail spending. So they are approaching us now to see whether we can collaborate on various things. They will sell the data, so that's always a procurement challenge for us, but there are increasing opportunities in that space. We are, however, still, for our outcomes data, very reliant on Statistics South Africa and on the data aggregators that take the national aggregated data and dilute that and disaggregate it for us. There's challenges with that, and we'll discuss some of those challenges, but there's a number of opportunities and challenges here. So that's our want to get into a little bit. I think you've probably heard enough from me. So I'm going to take it then to the panel. So the first question I'm going to ask, well maybe, yeah, let's do this because I think this is a good reflection on this. Is data at a city level taken seriously enough? So I pretty much want everybody's insights on this, but I'll start with Dieter and then feel free to jump in or interject. Are we taking data accessibilities for cities seriously enough?
I think we're catching up with the realization of how important city data is. How do we know how to do service delivery if we don't know where people are actually living? How do we know how businesses can function if we don't know how the city looks just on the ground? I think this is something which most African countries struggle with. We're not the Swedens and the Norways where everybody knows everything about everybody. And also it's the nature of our economy, which there is a significant part that's informal, and also the nature of housing, residential, which is informal, which makes it harder to measure. And that task in itself is one of the reasons why I think it probably isn't taken as seriously. It's just because how do you start measuring something that's very difficult to measure? You need to think beyond traditional ways of measurement. You need to think beyond things like survey data. You need to be able to connect different administrative data sources together to be able to put this big picture together. And these have both logistical constraints, but also administrative constraints, bureaucratic constraints, which one needs to surmount. So to do this, one really needs a coordinated effort to make this serious. And I think that's probably why we gathered here today.
Yeah. Great. Maybe just sorry, I'm going to leapfrog you and then come back to you, Andrew. Aliasgher, you've got a fairly good overview from our Open Cities Lab perspective on a few different cities, a bit of an international view as well. Do you agree with Dieter there that it's not being taken seriously enough? Are you seeing it emerge on the agenda in a concerted enough way?
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit provocative and disagree, actually. I think that there are things that are happening from a national level that I think are very interesting for cities. The question is always, what's national's role in the city space, right? I think that's the question we want to actually unpack. My view is that national kind of sets some standards or sets some aspects which then I think cities can emulate, especially secondary cities and those cities that are not metros, I think, right? So a few examples, I think. From a presidency level, there is Operation Vulunhlela that's being done. That's looking at digital public infrastructure. And there is things such as digital identity, digital payment systems, and data access, which is very crucial. Data access is what we are talking about, right? It's about how different departments can exchange data between each other. The second thing that's happening from a national level that OCL is involved in with the World Bank and StasSA actually is the data lake. And that data lake is about defining how do different departments exchange information. And again, here it's about showing an example that, okay, if this can happen between two different departments, how can other departments emulate that? And then the last example that I'll give is the National Strategic Hub, which I think all of you follow Sandy Limbata, Dr. Mbata, let me say that. He has been sharing quite a lot about that. And for example, he's creating the service delivery simulator with OCL, and they are also creating the Strategic Hub, which is pulling all of this data from different cities, which is an example of how national is playing a role in this. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but I think that those are steps that are taken from a national level that I think is playing a role and feeding into the cities.
Okay, that is encouraging. It's good to hear somebody with a broad view on that offer some motivation that we're sort of heading in the right direction. So Andrew, you are critical to the SARS data having been released and doing the coding around that, and that's been a big win. When can we expect CRPC and all of the other things? Talk a little bit about that process and what could be next on the horizon in terms of big admin data sets.
I think, let me find the appropriate distance here. I think following on from Aliasgher is important just in terms of thinking about those broader national initiatives and how they can enable opportunities for cities to get data sets like this, like the spatial tax panel has been a great opportunity, like you mentioned earlier. Within that South African integrated data lake project that Aliasgher mentioned, part of that is piloting in the first phase, piloting receiving different data sets, administrative data sets from different government agencies. And I think quite soon after that project is piloted, we'll start to be able to expand into other data sets. So, I mean, I think correct me if I'm wrong here, but the pilot includes different types of StasSA data, that some of which isn't released. It includes the SARS data and the business sampling frame that StasSA builds. They're also looking at the Department of Basic Education's education data. And there's one other use case, Department of Home Affairs. And I think these are all opportunities where there's useful information sitting there that might be applicable. I think it's making sure we have a functional use case for these to make sure that they are actually priorities for people like the municipalities to use, and then building something off that. But just, to Aliasgher's point, just de-siloing these agencies and making sure we have an opportunity to start sharing the data, I think is the first step, and then we can start exploring, okay, well, what if we put the Home Affairs data with the SARS data, and we could get a sense of families or households? Is there opportunity there? Or taking the basic education data and linking that to the SARS data and saying, what are education outcomes for people that grew up in these areas? Where did they end up working? Which schools are outperforming? How do we encourage how could we replicate what these schools are doing to help encourage better economic outcomes?
Yeah. So merging the kind of social data with some of this business data. Aliasgher, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, I think Andrew's point is very interesting here, because I think we underestimate the examples of showing when something good has happened. So for example, SEED SA data was shared, That's a great example. It's a long journey. And I'm sure there were so many hurdles in between that to get access to that data. And to be able to show that and to show what hurdles the team faced and what did they do to overcome those hurdles is very interesting actually for me. Because that really shows, look, we actually did all this in 10 years. I think it was 10 years, right? Wow. 10 years, and we faced these hurdles, and now we are able to do that. Because often people are just worried about putting data out there. Yeah. And I'm going to use, we did some research. I'm going to use the word research very carefully here because academics are going to come at me and go like, what is research should you do? No, we engaged some departments.
What was your confidence level?
What was my confidence level? So I'm not going to say the word research, ignore me. We engaged some departments in cities and we asked them, why are you worried about sharing data? Right? And they told us that we are worried because it's incomplete data and we are worried how it will look on the city and how it will look at my department. But no data starts perfectly, actually, right? No data actually starts perfectly. And
the StasSA data is a good example of that.
So that's the perfect example of showing that, okay, even if it's incomplete data, share it. Give access, because you start from a place of being incomplete to a place of being complete.
Yeah. Right? So that makes me think about something that Andrew said. He said, we need to demonstrate that we can use the data, whatever. And I do, to some degree, I do take issue with that. Is it the responsibility of users to demonstrate how they might use the data, to demonstrate responsibility or whatever, for the data to be provided? Or should that data just be provided? And then we'll find out along the way to some extent.
I think just reframing what I said, it's about prioritization. So, if we trying to engage different government departments to receive data, you need to do a prioritization because this is going to be valuable. And if you're building, spending time and resources building aggregated versions of data or de-identified versions of data that can be released publicly, you need to have some kind of end goal in mind. Otherwise, you've just got a bottomless pit of data and you can build 1,000 different things. So I think I definitely agree with your sentiments of putting more data out there, but I think in terms of building some of these things as we start to expand a program like the DIPS program as well as the SAIDL program that Aliasgher was mentioning, you need these use cases that say, okay, let's build something off this, and then we can start to, people can work on their own data sets that they release as opposed to a small team trying to produce that.
Dieter?
Demonstration builds trust. If you read these data reviews from a decade ago, they said there's nothing. And now we're starting to see these grass shoots. And as soon as this demonstrates something, there's openness to actually make use of data in other ways. So I do think it is important for researchers and for practitioners to really demonstrate the use of this data so that people don't see that it should just be hidden in places. We often speak about hidden data, which we don't know about. Yeah. And I think it needs to come out.
Yeah. So, I entirely agree. And I was being a bit provocative there. I think we have to be pragmatic about prioritization and limited resources. And to do that, sometimes we have to show return on investment in terms of what we're going to do for something. But at the same time, the intent should always be, where possible, to make that data available. But I wanted to, Aliasgher, just ask you the question, because we might have come across now as being a bit harsh on this kind of top-down approach so obviously with StasSA central to that. But what is the responsibility of cities themselves as data generators, as data collectors, and even as data assurers themselves? So not an over-reliance on national government. So if you could share some views, and then I'll come over to Dieter, because he said the loudest agreement there.
So just to be a bit specific, are you saying what is the role of cities to generate data? Is that what you're saying?
And to generate, so we're not talking about data as a byproduct here necessarily.
Yeah.
So obviously cities generate data all the time.
Yeah.
But we're talking about specific data, so and economic data and development data, which for the most part we rely on StasSA and data aggregators for.
So I think cities What's so interesting for me, and something that Ivan was talking about, is that each of the contexts within the cities are different, right? And that's where the context matters so much. So I wouldn't say Cape Town is the same as Joburg, and Joburg isn't the same as eThekwini, right? And so that, I think, means that cities should be generating the data, should be creating that data that they put out there as well. And I think the other role is attached to the previous point that was being said, was that how does cities show the value of how they are using data? And I'm a big fan of show and tells, actually, and use cases, because it kind of goes like, okay, look, we did this analysis. So Cape Town, for example, the census data, I think they did some census analysis recently. They show that we did this analysis, and then we did these outcomes from it. Because what I think data is such a complicated word, and I'm digressing a bit, because when we say data, I think someone thinks about this Excel sheet sitting somewhere, right? It's not about the data, actually. What matters is the outcomes, right? So it's like, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to actually make a decision about? And then you work backwards and go like, okay, then what is the data that I need, right? So if you're, for example, planning for Atlantis in Cape Town, if those of you who don't know Cape Town, it's in the northern suburbs of Cape Town. If you're planning for that, you need disaggregated data there to understand how you can provide for that. And I can give you an example here, because in my previous years, I was a tutor at University of Cape Town. And I remember we took this National Household Travel Survey data. Very good data. It goes to the local level. We took that data, we analyzed it. We went to Atlantis community and we went like, this is what the data says. Do you agree with this? And overwhelmingly, they said, no, actually. It's too aggregated. It's too upwards, right? And so they wanted to tell us their local experiences. And that's something the data wouldn't show us. And I think that's what matters. I think the context is what's key from cities.
Dieter?
So just as an example, you could use a StasSA survey to get some broad geographic perspectives, at least at provincial level, on some socioeconomic dimension. You could try and dig down onto a lower level, but the surveys aren't designed to do that. So small area statistics aren't reliable at survey level. And actually somebody at City of Cape Town asked me, because I tried to draw some maps on something like hunger, where is it distributed? And they said, can't we draw this down? And I said, no. I said, why don't you use your household survey to do that? And if we think of something like the Gauteng City Research Observatory, also doing very detailed location level data, to get at the context which is needed for that city and to understand where within cities are things very different. Where are these pockets of poverty? Where are these pockets of convenience? Is it too low? Yo. So, sorry about that. There we go. So the question is really, these survey data that are run by city themselves can drill down into pockets of poverty, pockets of socioeconomic development within the city that understand these contexts much better.
Can I come in, Paul? And I think, something that isn't always apparent to different departments within cities is the value of their data outside of their specific department. And I give a use case from New York that I was familiar with, where they have a complaint system, something called 311. People report every kind of service delivery complaints on there, but the department managing social housing started using this data, looking specifically at gas leak complaints and a few other kind of maintenance issues, and this helped them identify abusive landlords who were for rent control departments were trying to kind of leave services unattended to try and encourage residents to leave so they could raise the rents. That's just like one example, but there's thousands of examples like this where, you don't know as a specific user who's generating data, all the use cases. So having systems in place where this can be shared between departments becomes very important. And that's not just at a city level, that's also sending that data up to a national level to say, what can we see about what is happening in Cape Town versus what's happening in eThekwini, and are there benefits to knowing the differences here that matter?
Yeah. So that example really reminds me of, well, maybe we got it from New York. We've got something called a C3 notification system. And I do know our mayor at one point in time had gone and met with, previous mayor met with Bloomberg in New York. And that C3 notification also tries to track, aggregate all the different complaints in the city, and it's geolocated. Now that's for very specific reasons. You log a call and then somebody tries to come and fix your pothole. But we've been able to use that in interesting ways, and Kristoff and my team is sitting here. I was able to look at, we had a specific question about whether internal or external waste collectors are doing a better job, and whether the city should actually insource more or outsource more of that service. Now, you would have to run a massive survey through the various neighborhoods in Cape Town and actually ask them, was your stuff picked up on time, etc. So we didn't have that, and we didn't have the time to do that sort of thing. But we have this very comprehensive C3 notification system. So we were able to take the different complaints in the different areas, geolocate them, and then connect them to the shape files of the routes that are run by the different service providers and for the city as a whole. Control for a few things like propensity of an area to complain. So this is Kristoff's work. So I don't want to overplay my hand here. But control for things like propensity to complain and size of the population, and then get a fairly good sense of the quality that people are assigning to the different services. And so that's just an example of how data can be used in these innovative ways. The notification system was never meant for that purpose, but as a byproduct. But I'm going to switch tact a little bit now, because one of you said something that triggered me, not in a triggering way, but it reminded me of something. I think it was you, Andrew, or no, Dieter, it was yourself. You talked about sample surveys not being reliable at a local level, and certainly, so StasSA will say QLFS is at a Cape Town level, so we report on it. But work that Dr. Fouché has done in the past indicates that the error levels are high there, and only when there's very large changes can we say something meaningful has changed. So I want to then, with that in mind, ask the question of how big an issue is it that there have been significant challenges in the census and the sub-metro estimates and findings for, or the sub-national findings for the census?
Yep. So this is a big question, and I think something which many of us worry about at this stage. There have been reports that have been very critical of the census. We know about the 30% unaccount. And one of the aspects that has been highlighted is subnational estimates. And I think this could be even a bigger problem within cities. And that could be huge for us. So as we know, a lot of surveys that are designed use sampling frames which come from censuses. So it would be interesting to hear how the new sampling frames will be updated. We know, for instance, in the past, when sampling frames have been updated, that survey data changes in ways that are unpredictable. So even employment levels within cities, they change discretely because the sampling frame has changed. So this is a question of how does survey design depend on census, and everything else depends on that, right? So all of these come back to the census. Even population level estimates come back to census on some level at some stage. The one thing that is a positive from doing a census is you obviously update the dwelling frame. So we know at least where the dwellings are, but it's the reweighting that happens, and updating the reweighting, which surveys need to be done, that could potentially be a concern going into the future, and mean especially at subnational level.
And just to flip it more proactively as well, are there, and it reverts to a question we asked earlier about the role of cities in this, are there substitutes, or is census the one thing where there are no substitutes?
So a lot of developed countries are moving away from censuses, and they're just not doing censuses at all anymore. And it's because of the large availability of alternative data sources. The one thing, of course, if you're Sweden, you have administrative records on every person in the country, and you know where they live, you know what jobs they're doing. We're not Sweden. We have a large informal sector. We have a lot of people moving in and out of jobs. So we shouldn't hold ourselves to that high standard. I don't think we can. We're very far from that. The alternatives is then to look at other data sources, which are proxies. They're not going to be a perfect substitute, but they are some sort of substitute. I think somebody mentioned mobile phone data earlier on, which gives us a sense of where people are. And I'm not sure whether it can really tell us whether they're employed or not. Maybe whether they have a contract or not could help us. But these kinds of things don't proxy for things like employment, but they do tell us where people are and how they're moving. So that kind of data source is very important. I think especially in data scarce contexts, economists have relied a lot. Somebody mentioned, I think you even mentioned, things like remote sensing. It at least tells us where dwellings are. Doesn't necessarily tell us how many people are inside of those dwellings. But it does give us a sense of where economies are concentrated, even at a very subnational level. Something which, the typical use case has been something like the nightlights data to tell us where our economy is located. But I think things are advancing far more beyond that. So for instance, knowing where solar PV is located within cities and on houses, this is becoming possible with machine learning algorithms and on the rooftops, and being able to identify where are the solar panels. So these are all proxy data sets. And I think we're going to eventually have to layer these things on top of each other to get a good sense of where things are happening. We spoke about backyarding. The World Bank and the city has done a lot of work on that using satellite data. We're going to have to overlay all of these things on top of each other to get a good picture, especially when we're working with a lot of different imperfect sources. And I'd like to support your notion saying that just because data is imperfect doesn't mean we shouldn't use it. We need to triangulate and overlay different sources of data to get a good picture of what's happening.
Yeah, that's fascinating as a lead into another question. But I wanted to ask Andrew, so you're working with largely administrative data and obviously tax data and that. And I know that you have compared it to quarterly employment survey and some of those ones to test validity and the like. Have you looked at any big data sources and tried to kind of do any correlation analysis with that? Is it on the agenda?
You mean using like night lights or?
Yeah, whether it's night lights,
other remote sensing
yeah,
data.
or mobile phone data, or yeah.
I mean, it's definitely something we'd like to do more of. We haven't done as much as we have. I think we focused on official statistics at this point, but it definitely is on the agenda.
So this wasn't the reason I asked the question, but now I am thinking about it. We had a provision of mobile phone data from Vodacom for a while, and then we looked at the SARS data, at employment at place of work, and they did match up. I mean, they matched up very well. So geographically matched up very well. But I think that offers a lot of opportunities as well, the kind of big data frontier. But I'm going to move on because I do want to allow some time for some questions as well. Fouché, is that fine if we do? Okay. All right, so I'm going to just do one or two more questions here, and I think get at the crux of an issue that a lot of us face at a city level, and that's data aggregators. So at the moment, although StasSA and my colleagues here from StasSA are going for the regional GDP again, which is great, and we're glad to hear that. For the most part, we've had to, for a number of years, and at a city level, actually, we've always had to rely on the likes of Quantic, of IHS, to do that. And we put up with it, knowing, however, that there's a bit of a black box methodology, and knowing that maybe the confidence rates aren't that high. So there's two questions I want to ask, and I'll pitch them to yourself first, Dieter, but anyone can also come in. The first is, do cities actually need to report on everything? I think this is a question Arthur has asked me in the past. Do we really need to report on GDP growth and by sector and frequently? I've got my own views on that, but that's the one question. The second question is, do we have to have 95% confidence intervals? Or can we feel that we can put up with, 70% and an uncertain methodology because it's essential? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so cities as a whole. Can you hear me now? Okay. Cities as a whole, I think, do want to know how they're developing. Is their economy growing fast enough? Are they generating the right number of employees? Whether they should or whether they want to, that's a different question. Cities often want to do it, politically speaking. It's a politically charged number. Our city is generating more employment than yours, and it has been used in the media quite often, right? So, should they or do they? That's a different question. I won't go into that too deeply, but I do think cities do want to know: are they generating enough employment? Which sectors are growing and which aren't? I think that's part of planning. To know exactly where they are growing, it could be helpful. I think you were mentioning the Pardon Island example. To know where certain growth points are happening and is the support infrastructure correct for that, it could be helpful. But to do a data deep dive on every single aspect, that might be too costly. So I think the answer is somewhere in between. There's a trade-off between knowing exactly everything in the minutest detail to knowing for strategic planning. So you might not want to know how much is happening on top of Table Mountain, but you do want to know how much is happening in crucial areas where you know there might be a housing project coming up here. What is happening in the sectors going on there to link these different aspects of the economy.
And any views from the panel in general on the pragmatic use of data aggregators? I'm sure you have, but anyone else? Otherwise, we'll come back to Dieter as well.
I mean, I think they have an important role to play because, often it is that whether it's government or someone else isn't moving fast enough to get a data set out there. So, I mean, if they can supply that service for a bit and eventually it gets taken over and becomes institutionalized somewhere, I think there's value in that. But I mean, the danger is always around these black boxes and not knowing what the methodology is and how that might bias how you would use it. So, I mean, I think big disclaimers, but I think it is playing a very important role, and they exist for a reason. The market's responded to a gap.
Okay. All right, I'm sure we all have further perspectives on that, and maybe they can come out in the discussion. But I would like to give a little bit of time for the audience to pose any questions here. Hopefully, this conversation has stimulated some questions that are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, and thank you very much for this interesting discussion. And this is a local data. It's just one of the hottest topic in this generation or this time. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, they have got a team which is monitoring the SDGs. So they wrote a document in 2022, and they suggested that data and information has to be disaggregated, not only at the lower administrative level, local level, but it has to be on other socio-demographic levels like various demographics, genders, age, marital status, race, income level, disability status. We need this kind of data to monitor issues at the lowest level, at the domain level. That's the case. I'm an official statistician. I've been working on small area estimation in the past 10, 12 years. And the challenge in the developing countries is, there are two challenges. One is when we go to domain level, there's an issue of confidentiality. Like, they don't share the information because of the issues related to confidentiality. I would like to hear from you guys if you say something about that. And the other issue is also the politicians. I remember just a few years ago, I was presenting a paper at the African Economic Conference. It's a poverty mapping using Ethiopian data. After the presentation, one of the minister just followed me. Why did you expose us? Because I tried to show the dissimilarities, because they are happy to say, in this province, this is the poverty. In this province, this is the poverty. When I go to down, there are districts or local municipal, their wards, which contains the highest poverty or unemployment rate or other things. So any idea that you want to say, I would be happy. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I think let's take another 2 in this round.
Wow, sure.
Okay, so there's been some talk about triangulating estimates, including the census estimates using alternative data sources. And so my question would be, to what extent is that possible within the current organizational structures, including the available skills in say, StasSA, or to what extent will it be required to have kind of an independent external body that is perhaps less encumbered by legacy systems and legacy ways of doing things? Because if you're going to go from a survey-based census to one that's triangulated using alternative data, so on one hand you need a very different skill set to accomplish those two things, and on the other hand that's not really what some of these state entities have been designed to do, or really I can't speak to the capability, but it would be a significant change. And having worked in the public sector, I know it doesn't necessarily do change all that well or fast.
Okay, can we do one more in this round, and then we'll do one other round, if that's all right? Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm going to stand up because I'm rather short. So I sit at the nexus between the policy and the academic. And I want to put out to this group that the potential for admin data is huge as we start to see a constraint on official data sources. And particularly as we start to, Ivan, you talked about the spatial dynamics and the essentially the increasing pace of urbanization. As we have the increasing pace, our flows of funding should be following. And so there's a unique opportunity to say, okay, well, our data sources that are defining those flows are not keeping pace. So I've been writing LinkedIn blogs on the provincial equitable share, but the local government equitable share is even more constrained by the census data and the very, very late publication of the next income and expenditure survey data, only in December. So the last data point was 2010. And that gives you an idea that the cities are being, their flow of funding from at a city level, and while it's not so important for a big city, it's really important at the more local level, and as you start looking at intermediary city migration. And so the spatial dynamics as a flow. So I want to put out to this group that the tax data was the first reach, but it is most likely, and it would be useful to understand from the international best practices, that admin data is going to be the norm. It's far easier to fact verify, triangulate, correlate administrative data than it would be on survey data, and where survey data's got holes and constraints. Yet we don't have the infrastructure, the institutional capability, and the coordination mechanisms to go that. That said, South Africa's always been really great at your constraint becomes your opportunity. So I want to put out to the panel here, how can we make the constraint our opportunity, particularly as from a funding side and from the fiscus, we start to say, how do we capture spatial dynamic flows a lot better in South Africa moving forward? Thanks.
All right, nobody said it would be easy. So let's take the first one on, and I think I'm going to ask yourself, Andrew, because of the confidentiality issue. And I know you deal a lot with this, with the masking of data. But then I don't know, Aliasgher, if you want to talk to the politics of it as well. But yeah, so how does one, when we get to those very fine-grained levels, what do we do for in terms of confidentiality?
I mean, I think there's a lot of strategies out there, and I think it depends largely on the data sources that you have and what kind of data it is and what is sensitive within that data. But to give an example of what we do with the spatial tax panel, we're very selective of which data sets go out. So there's a screening of which type of information is going out. Is it sensitive? How do we then group things together to make sure they become less sensitive? How do we aggregate income income levels to a level that's not considered sensitive. But then we have a masking approach. So within any aggregation, spatial, time, and various other aggregate indicators, you're not allowed to have less than 10 of any observation in there. So that, I mean, obviously you need to come back and think about what other data sets you're releasing, because there's a hierarchical issue, and identification through differencing is a concern. But by being careful about how you select all of these and adding in that kind of masking component, you can manage this. What we also do with that is we add in further kind of algorithmic approaches that, we often aren't counting individuals. We're counting for, a full-time equivalent employee that isn't one. So, one full-time equivalent employee isn't one person, one individual, and that further helps you. So, I mean, I think depending on the data, there's always opportunities and ways to do this, and that's one example. I think there's a lot of ways to deal with disclosure control when trying to release administrative data sets or survey data sets or other kinds of data.
And then Aliasgher, just on the politics, I would have some views, but I'm interested from an external view as well.
I'm just going to actually answer both of them, if that's okay, but very quickly. I have a long answer, but I'm going with the short one. So the first one is about people not giving access to data. I think people are always worried about giving access to data, and they will always find a reason to not give access to data. I feel like they'll be like, oh, look, there is this one data set that's there that I can't share with you. And my opinion on this is that delete that column and give access to that data. So if that one or two columns are the problem, give access to the data. And I think it's just a thinking process that if you find reasons, you'll find millions of reasons to not share the data. So I think you can go around the confidentiality part of it. The second part is the data is making us look bad. I mean, I think, again, this is a perception thing. What is it that citizens don't know that you're sharing, actually? So if a South African city suddenly releases data that they are not doing good service delivery, how shocking. We all know that, right? So I understand, but I think people often think that it's going to make you look bad. But I think it's interesting that when you put out data, you're actually showing confidence that we know there is a problem here. We know, but we are going to fix that problem. And something we are working with in South African cities is we are telling them, okay, what is the smallest, simplest data that you can put out there that will not cause any commotion? And just by thinking that way, that slowly, you try to make people think about how to be more open and start sharing data. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Dieter, this issue that's been brought up, I'm going to combine Kristoff and Shirley's points here about the potential of admin data to play a role, and maybe a more responsive role than some of the large scale, so the census and the surveys that take longer. Do we have the capacity as a country within academia or within our institutions to do this sort of thing? Or is it still, I mean, I asked you it partly earlier, but let's reflect on this.
Thank you. I think what's important to see here, I think one of the things that was mentioned was triangulation. Do we have the skill set to do that? I think we have the skill set to do that. I think it's not a difficult thing to do. I think a large part of it is about bringing all these different data sources together. Part of that is a bureaucratic process, being able to get the data sharing agreements into place, being able to really put these things together so that different departments, different data providers actually speak to each other. I think that's to me the big starting point, is to be able to get these data sources together and build that trust to say that I trust you with my data to put it together with that data. I think it comes back a bit to the issues of confidentiality. Aren't we building a big picture about individuals, and are there dangers in that? And I think that's what people worry about in this triangulation process. I don't think any party can do it on its own. Academia can't do it on its own. We don't have access to that data, but we are able to advocate. We are able to bring a coordinating factor for that. And I do think we can bring the different organizations together who are able to do this. So I think this is definitely something we need.